She was walking down the aisle in a church full of candles and white lilies and black ribbon, and she was smiling. Not the smile of a nervous bride, not the smile of a woman overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. This was something else entirely. This was the smile of a woman who had been cheated on, humiliated, left alone in a parking garage at midnight, and had turned every single moment of that pain into the most powerful decision of her life. She is black, beautiful, and unstoppable. And the man waiting for her at the altar was the most dangerous man in the room. A Korean Mafia boss, calm as still water, tatouages climbing his neck, eyes that had seen things most people never survive seeing. 200 guests filling that church, half of them on his payroll. And then, the doors burst open. The man who had destroyed her stood at the back of the room, the ex who had cheated, the surgeon with the easy smile and the empty promises. He had driven 4 hours to stop this wedding. He had a speech prepared. He had convinced himself, completely and architecturally, that he was doing this for her. He had no idea what he had walked into. He had no idea that this black woman, the one he had underestimated, the one he had betrayed, the one he had left alone in the dark, had spent 8 months building something he could never touch. Something with legal protection in 3 jurisdictions. Something with a man beside her who had told her the truth before she even thought to ask for it. What she said to him next, in front of everyone, silenced that entire church. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a church before a wedding begins. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of held breath, of 200 people pressing their anticipation against the walls of a sacred room and waiting for something to happen that cannot be undone. The candles along the aisle burned low and gold that afternoon, their light catching the white lilies tied to every pew with black ribbon. An unusual choice, people had whispered when the invitations arrived. Black ribbon at a wedding? But then again, nothing about this union had followed the expected script. The organ had gone quiet 3 minutes ago. The doors at the back of the church had not yet opened. And in that suspended moment, in that pocket of collective waiting, a man named Marcus Webb stood near the back wall with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set like a man who had already rehearsed what he was going to say, but was no longer certain he believed it. He had driven 4 hours to be here. He had not been invited. Little did he know that, at that exact moment, the woman he had come to stop was standing behind those closed doors, with her hand resting lightly on the arm of her uncle, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that no one else in the room could see. And she was smiling. Not the trembling, tearful smile of a woman overwhelmed by the weight of a moment. Something older than that. Quieter. The smile of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has finally arrived at the last move of a game she began playing 8 months ago in a parking garage, sitting alone in a car, in the dark, saying thank you to no one. Aaliyah Monroe had always been the kind of woman who made people uncomfortable without meaning to. She was too composed, too precise. In law school, her professors had praised her analytical mind with the slight edge in their voices that people use when they mean something they are not saying, as though her clarity of thought was a quality that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. She had graduated second in her class at Columbia, taken a position at Hargrove and Sinclair before she had even crossed the stage to collect her diploma, and spent the next 5 years building a reputation as the attorney you called when the situation was already past saving. She was 31 years old when she passed the bar, and 28 when she met Marcus, which meant she had spent exactly 3 years constructing a life around a man who had spent those same 3 years constructing a version of himself that did not entirely exist. Marcus Webb was, by every visible measure, what the world called a good man. He was handsome in the way that reads as trustworthy, square jaw, easy laugh, a medical degree from Johns Hopkins mounted in a mahogany frame above his desk. He volunteered at a free clinic every second Saturday. He remembered the names of waitstaff. He called his mother on Sunday evenings. He had proposed to Aaliyah at the top of the High Line on a Tuesday morning before the tourists arrived, with a ring she had not expected and a speech she could not have scripted. And she had said yes before he had even finished the sentence, because she believed, in the uncomplicated way that people believe things when they are not yet watching for the cracks, that this was the man she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. What Aaliyah did not know, what no one who loved Marcus allowed themselves to fully see, was that the ease with which he moved through the world was not a character trait. It was a skill. Marcus had learned very early that the world forgave beautiful, confident men almost anything, and he had spent his adult life testing the precise limits of that forgiveness. He was not cruel. That was important to understand. Cruelty requires intention, and Marcus had never intended anything he had done. He had simply never fully believed that consequences would reach him. Not because he was arrogant, exactly. More because he had spent 31 years watching them fail to arrive. "You destroyed me, Marcus. Destroyed me," were not words Aaliyah said the night she came home early from her conference in Chicago and found what she found. She had stood in the doorway of their bedroom for exactly 4 seconds. She had counted them later, the way you count things when your mind is refusing to process what your eyes are delivering. And then she had stepped back, pulled the door closed, and walked to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water. She drank it. She rinsed the glass and set it in the drying rack. And then she picked up her keys, walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and did not cry until she was in the car with the doors locked and the engine off. And even then, it was only for 11 minutes, which she also counted. What happened next was the part that no one, not Marcus, not his friends who would eventually take his side, not the colleague who had been in that bed and who would have the nerve to send Aaliyah a text message the following week, beginning with the words, "I just want to explain," would ever fully understand. Aaliyah did not call anyone. She did not post anything. She did not spiral. She sat in the underground parking garage of the building where she had lived with Marcus Webb for 2 years and 4 months, and she thought with extraordinary calm about what she actually wanted. Not what she was supposed to want. Not what the situation demanded she feel. What she, Aaliyah Monroe, actually wanted from the hours that remained of her life. And what she realized sitting there in the dark with the engine off and the city humming somewhere above her was that she felt, beneath the grief, something that embarrassed her. Something she did not tell anyone for a very long time afterward. She felt relieved. Not because she did not love him. She had loved him genuinely and completely. But the love had required a kind of constant, low-grade vigilance that she had spent 3 years telling herself was normal. And in the parking garage, it became very suddenly clear to her that it was not normal, and had never been, and that she had known this for some time without letting herself know it. She started the car. She drove. She ended up, 40 minutes later, at a bar in Midtown she had passed 100 times and never entered. One of those establishments that announces its quality through deliberate understatement. No sign above the door, no music spilling into the street. Just dark glass and brass handles, and the faint, warm smell of expensive wood. She sat at the bar and ordered the wrong drink, a Negroni when she had meant to say old-fashioned, and drank it anyway because she was not yet ready to make another decision, even a small one. She did not notice the man at the far end of the bar. Most people didn't. That was, as she would learn much later, entirely intentional. What she noticed instead was that her Negroni was replaced, without her asking, by an old-fashioned. Exactly what she had meant to order. And when she looked up at the bartender, he simply gestured toward the far end of the bar and said, with the particular discretion of a man who is very well paid to be discreet, that it was from the gentleman at table 10. She looked. He was not looking back. He was reading something on his phone with the kind of absolute stillness that very few people are capable of in public spaces. Not the stillness of someone pretending to be calm, but the genuine article. The stillness of a man for whom composure is not a performance, but a default setting. He was Korean, perhaps mid-30s, with sharp, clean features and the collar of his dark shirt open just enough to reveal the edge of something inked along the side of his neck. Characters she would later learn to read, though that understanding would take months and patience and a willingness to sit with things she did not yet understand. She picked up the old-fashioned. She did not wave. She did not mouth, "Thank you." She simply looked at him for a moment, the way you look at something you are not yet sure how to categorize. And then she turned back to the bar. And across the room, Kwon Chae-hyun finally looked up from his phone, and the corner of his mouth moved, barely, before he looked back down. Little did either of them know that those 4 seconds at a bar in Midtown Manhattan were the pivot on which the next 8 months of both their lives would quietly, irreversibly turn. And that a man called Marcus Webb, driving home from a late shift at the hospital at that very moment, was already too far behind to catch what was beginning. The morning after the bar, Aaliyah did not call Marcus. This was, in itself, a kind of statement. In their 3 years together, she had never gone more than 14 hours without some form of contact. A text, a brief call between depositions, the small daily maintenance that couples perform without thinking. The way you oil a door so it doesn't creak. Marcus noticed the silence at around 9 in the morning, when he woke and found her side of the bed undisturbed. And he told himself she had taken an early flight back to New York and gone directly to the office. He told himself this with the particular confidence of a man who has always found that the stories he tells himself tend, eventually, to become true. She had, in fact, gone directly to the office. But not before stopping at the apartment at 6 in the morning while Marcus was still asleep, packing 1 large suitcase and 2 boxes of professional materials with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been mentally rehearsing this moment for longer than she had consciously admitted. Leaving her key on the kitchen counter beside a glass of water she had poured and then decided not to drink, and walking back to the elevator without looking at the bedroom door. The key made a small sound against the granite. Clean. Final. The kind of sound a period makes at the end of a sentence. At the office, she filed 3 briefs, attended a deposition, and ate lunch at her desk. Her assistant, a perceptive young woman named Dana who had worked with Aaliyah for 2 years and understood instinctively that certain silences were not invitations, brought her coffee twice without being asked, and did not comment on the suitcase standing against the far wall of the office. That evening, Aaliyah checked into the Baccarat Hotel on 53rd Street, the kind of place that requires no explanation to the front desk, that asks no questions, that simply provides 800 thread count sheets and a view of the city that makes the city look, briefly, like something that belongs to you. Marcus called at 7. She let it ring. He called again at 7:40. She silenced it. At 8:15, he sent a text that read, "Leah, please call me. We need to talk." And she looked at it for a long moment and then set the phone face down on the nightstand and ordered room service and watched the lights of Midtown come on one by one through the floor-to-ceiling window. What Marcus did not understand, what he would not understand for a very long time, perhaps not fully even now, was that Aaliyah's silence was not cruelty, and it was not avoidance. It was conclusion. She had already processed the end of their relationship in that parking garage, in 11 minutes of honest crying and 40 minutes of clear thinking. And she had arrived at the hotel not raw and broken, but organized. Grief had not left her. It moved through her in waves over the days that followed, arriving without warning in the middle of a sentence or at the bottom of a cup of coffee. But grief and decision were, for Aaliyah Monroe, two entirely separate things that did not interfere with each other. She had learned this young. It was one of the few gifts a difficult childhood reliably delivers. She returned to the Midtown bar on a Wednesday. She had not planned to. She had been walking back from a client dinner and had found herself standing in front of the dark glass doors, with no clear memory of having turned in their direction. She went in because it seemed ridiculous not to, and because the alternative was returning to the hotel room and sitting alone with her thoughts, which she had been doing for 4 days, and which was beginning to wear on her in the particular way that solitude wears on people who are good at being alone, but were not designed to be alone indefinitely. He was there. Same table, same stillness. This time, when the bartender moved to replace her drink, she shook her head slightly and picked up her glass and walked to table 10 herself. She stood at the edge of it for a moment. She would describe this later, to no one, as the longest 3 seconds of a year full of long seconds. And then she said, without preamble, because preamble had never been her natural language, "Why the old-fashioned?" He looked up. Up close, the tattoos on his neck were more elaborate than they had appeared from across the room. Dense, deliberate characters that climbed from his collar to just below his jaw, the ink dark and precise against pale skin. His eyes were very steady. Not the steadiness of a man suppressing something. The steadiness of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "You hesitated before you ordered," he said. People hesitate when they're about to say something that isn't quite true. She sat down. "Kwon Jae-hyun," he said, and did not extend his hand. Not a slight. She understood this instantly, with the professional instinct of a woman who spent her working life reading the subtext of rooms. Just a man who did not perform warmth he did not yet feel. "Aaliyah Monroe," she said, and did not extend hers either. They stayed at that table for 2 hours and 40 minutes. They talked about very little of consequence. The architecture of the neighborhood, a case she mentioned in general terms, a film he had seen twice. She did not ask what he did. He did not ask why she was alone. These omissions were mutual and comfortable. The way silences between two people are comfortable only when both of them have chosen the silence rather than falling into it. What Aaliyah felt, walking back to the hotel that night, was not attraction in the simple sense. It was something more structural. The recognition of a person who operated at the same temperature she did. The world was full of people who ran hot, who broadcast their feelings like weather systems, whose joy and anger and need arrived before they did. Marcus had been like that, underneath the polish. Volatile in the small ways, always requiring calibration. Jae-hyun was the opposite. He was a closed system. And she, who had spent 3 years managing another person's emotional climate, found the closed system startling and then quietly extraordinary. She did not know that night what he was. She knew he was wealthy. The table, the deference of the staff, the quality of the silence that surrounded him in a way that silence does not surround ordinary people. She knew he was careful. She knew he was watching things she could not see. She did not know the specific nature of his business, the structure of his organization, the precise reason why 3 men at separate tables in that bar were positioned the way chess pieces are positioned. Not for decoration, but for function. She would learn, not all at once, in the particular way that Jae-hyun shared anything, incrementally, without ceremony, as though information were a language and he was teaching it to her 1 word at a time. "You are a lawyer," he said on their 4th meeting. It was not a question. "Corporate," she said. "I protect people from the consequences of their decisions, usually after the decisions have already been made." He considered this. That must be frustrating. "It's clarifying," she said. "You learn very quickly that most catastrophes were visible in advance. People just preferred not to look." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes," he said, and something in the word carried a weight that she filed away and did not examine until much later. Their 5th meeting was not at the bar. He called. She had given him her card on the 2nd meeting, the professional card, the one with only her work number, and asked if she would have dinner. She said yes with the same tone she used to accept a meeting request. They ate at a restaurant in the West Village where the staff knew him and where he ordered for both of them without asking, not out of presumption, but because he had clearly thought about it in advance, which she found, against her expectations, considerate rather than controlling. It was at this dinner that he told her, without flinching, what he was. Not everything, but enough. He told her that his business interests were diverse and that some of them existed in spaces that the law did not adequately illuminate. He told her that he had enemies, that he had structure around him that most people never saw, that the life he lived required a particular kind of partner, someone who understood the architecture of power without being frightened by it, someone who could sit at a table with dangerous people and be the most dangerous person there without ever raising her voice. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you should choose what you choose with full information. I do not want anything from you that you have not decided to give." Aaliyah looked at him across the candlelight for a long moment. "You destroyed me, Marcus. Destroyed me." Those were the words she had not said. And here was a man who was handing her the blueprint of his destruction before she had even decided whether to enter the building. "I appreciate the disclosure," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "I'll need time to consider the terms." "Of course," he said. She considered them for 3 weeks. She reviewed what she could find, which was less than she expected, which was itself informative. She consulted no one. She slept on it every night and woke every morning and tested the shape of it against what she knew about herself, about risk, about the specific texture of safety she had been chasing her whole life and had never quite managed to find in the places she had been told to look. And then she called him and said yes. What neither of them fully anticipated was how quickly yes would become something more than a transaction. How the careful, contractual architecture of their arrangement would develop, in the spaces between meetings and phone calls and quiet dinners, the unmistakable weight of something real. Little did Jae-hyun know, as he sat across from her in that West Village restaurant and laid out the terms of a life she had not expected to want, that he was already more invested than he had intended to be. Little did Aaliyah know, as she processed his disclosure with the analytical precision that had defined her entire professional life, that she was not, in fact, being purely analytical at all. And Marcus Webb, at that exact moment, was sitting in the apartment they used to share, surrounded by her absence, beginning to understand. Slowly, too slowly, in the way that realization arrives for people who have never had to practice it, that he had miscalculated something fundamental. He just did not yet know how fundamental. The proposal happened on a Thursday evening in November, when the city had turned cold enough to remind people that warmth was not a given. Jae-hyun had called that afternoon and asked her to come to the penthouse. Not the hotel he used for business, but the other one. The one she had been to only twice, the one with no staff visible and no art on the walls, and a view of the Hudson that made the river look like a seam in the world where two different realities had been stitched imperfectly together. She had worn a charcoal blazer and dark trousers because she had come from the office, and she had not changed because she had learned, in the months of knowing him, that Jae-hyun did not require performance. He noticed what she wore the way he noticed everything, completely, without comment. She arrived at 7. He was standing at the window with his back to the door when she came in, which was unusual. He was a man who always faced the room. She said his name and he turned, and she saw, for only the second time since she had known him, something in his face that was not composed. Not distress. She was not certain he experienced distress in any form she would recognize. Something more precise. The look of a man who has made a decision and is standing on the near side of it, about to speak it into existence and understanding that the speaking will make it irreversible. On the low table between the two chairs where they usually sat, there was a small black box and a document. The box she understood immediately. The document took her a moment longer, and then she recognized the format, the clause structure, the deliberate architecture of legal protection, and something in her chest moved that she did not immediately name. He had written her a contract. Not a prenuptial agreement in the conventional sense. Something more comprehensive, more specific. A document that outlined in precise legal language what she would be protected from, what she would have access to, what would happen in every scenario he had been able to imagine, including the ones that were not supposed to happen. He had had it prepared by 3 separate attorneys in 3 separate jurisdictions. She would learn this later. That evening, she simply stood and looked at it. "You had this drafted," she said. "Yes. Before asking me. Yes, I wanted you to be able to read it before you decide it, not after." She picked up the document. She did not pick up the box. She read it standing, which took 11 minutes. She was a fast reader, but she was reading carefully, the way she read everything that mattered. And it mattered enormously. And when she finished, she set it down and looked at him and said, "There are 2 clauses in Section 4 that need revision." The corner of his mouth moved. "I expected that. I'll mark them." "I know." She picked up the pen from the table. He had left a pen, of course he had left a pen, and annotated the margins of Section 4 with the focused brevity of someone who does this for a living. Then she set the pen down. She looked at the box. She looked at him. "You could have just asked," she said. "You deserved the information first," he said. "You can decide what you want when you know what you are deciding." Aaliyah Monroe had been proposed to once before. Marcus had done it at the top of the High Line with a speech and the crowd of early morning joggers who had briefly stopped to watch and had applauded when she said yes. She had cried then. Happy tears, real ones, the kind that arrive before you have decided to feel anything. Standing in the penthouse with the Hudson behind the glass and the contract on the table, and a man who had prepared for her refusal as carefully as he had prepared for her acceptance, she did not cry. What she felt was something she would spend weeks afterward trying to name correctly. Not romance exactly, though it was that too underneath. It was the feeling of being seen, fully, without flattery, without the edited version of herself she usually offered the world. He had looked at all of it, her intelligence, her caution, her history, her capacity for both warmth and cold precision, and he had not tried to soften any of it. He had simply made room for it. She opened the box. The ring was not what she would have expected from a man of his wealth. Not ostentatious, nothing that announced itself. A single dark diamond, almost black, set in a clean gold band. The kind of ring that rewarded attention rather than demanding it. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Aaliyah Monroe and precision was her native language, "With the revisions to Section 4. "Of course," he said. What neither of them said, standing in the penthouse with the city spread below them and the ring on her finger and the annotated contract on the table, was that they were both, in their separate and parallel ways, afraid. Not of each other, of the specific vulnerability that comes from wanting something real after having survived the alternatives. Jae-hyun had not allowed himself to want anything personal in 4 years, since the last time, the circumstances of which Aaliyah knew only in outline, enough to understand why he moved the way he moved, and spoke the way he spoke, and prepared for abandonment the way some people prepare for natural disasters. Quietly, constantly, without ever entirely believing it won't come. And Aaliyah had not allowed herself to trust her own judgment since the parking garage, since the 4 seconds in the doorway, since the 11 minutes of crying. That lingering suspicion that the clarity she prided herself on had failed her once at close range and could fail her again. Little did either of them know, in that quiet penthouse moment, that the real test of what they were building was not coming from the world outside. It was already parked in Marcus Webb's driveway, in the form of a black invitation to a wedding he had not been sent, which he had found through a contact of a contact, and which he had been staring at on his kitchen counter for 3 days, trying to decide what a man of his particular character decides in such a situation. Marcus had not taken the end of the relationship well. This was, perhaps, an understatement. He had not taken it at all, in the sense that he had never fully arrived at acceptance. He had cycled instead through a series of adjacent states, each of which had the shape of acceptance without the substance. He had been angry, briefly, in the specific way of men who are unaccustomed to being left. A hot, disbelieving anger that expressed itself in long texts he sometimes sent and sometimes deleted, and a habit of driving past the building where Aaliyah now lived, slowly, without stopping, like a man conducting surveillance on his own grief. He had been contrite, which had involved a great deal of effort and a florist, and 2 letters that she had not responded to. He had been philosophical, briefly, in the way that people are philosophical when they are waiting for philosophy to stop being necessary. And then, when philosophy failed him, he had done what Marcus Webb had always done when the story he was telling himself required external validation. He had told it to someone else. In this case, a friend from medical school named Derek, who had listened and nodded and said all the things that Derek reliably said, and who had also, in a moment that Marcus had not fully registered at the time, mentioned that he had heard through several degrees of separation that Aaliyah was seeing someone. Who? Marcus had asked, with the studied casualness of a man who wants very badly to know something and does not want to want it. Derek had told him what he knew, which was partial and secondhand, and delivered with the slight relish that some people cannot suppress when delivering bad news. Korean, older, wealthy in a way that was not entirely explained by his public business interests. Marcus had sat with this information for 2 weeks. He had researched, not deeply enough. He would never understand afterward how badly he had failed to understand what he was looking at. How the visible surface of Jaehyun's world bore almost no relationship to its actual structure. How the hotels and the property holdings and the consultancy firm were a facade of such exquisite craftsmanship that it had fooled considerably more sophisticated investigators than a cardiovascular surgeon with a laptop and a free evening. He had found enough to make him uneasy. He had not found enough to make him careful. "You destroyed me, Aaliyah. Destroyed me!" He had said this, finally, to the empty apartment, alone on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks before the wedding, and the sound of his own voice saying it had frightened him slightly. The raw, declaratory force of it. The way it had come out of him like something that had been pressurized for months. He had stood in his kitchen afterward and gripped the counter and breathed carefully and told himself he needed to do something. Not for pride, for her. He had convinced himself in the complete and architectural way that Marcus convinced himself of things, that what he was feeling was concern. He had gone to her office 2 days later. She had been at her desk when he appeared at the door. Dana had tried to stop him, and he had smiled the smile that had always worked on everyone in his life, and said it was important, and Dana, who was perceptive but not immune, had let him through with visible reluctance. Aaliyah had looked up from her screen. She had not looked surprised. She had looked, he thought, as though she had been expecting him, and was mildly disappointed that he had taken this long. "You need to leave him," he said. He had planned a longer opening, but it evaporated when he saw her face. "Hello, Marcus," she said. "Leah, listen to me. You don't know what you're involved in. This man, what he does, the people around him, you could get hurt. Seriously hurt. I'm not saying this to Marcus." Her voice was quiet, not unkind, worse than unkind. It was the voice she used with clients who had come to her after the damage was already done. "I know exactly what I'm involved in." "You don't." "I know more about it than you do," she said. "I have read documents you could not access. I have had conversations you could not imagine. I have made a fully informed decision with complete information and legal protection in place." She paused. "The question I keep returning to is, where was this concern 3 years ago, when I was fully involved in you?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Marcus Webb had ever heard. The morning of the wedding arrived the way significant mornings always do, without ceremony, without the dramatic overture that the occasion seemed to demand. The city was cold and silver, the sky the particular flat white of November in New York that neither threatens rain nor promises sun, simply exists as a kind of atmospheric neutrality that leaves all the emotional weather to the people moving beneath it. Aaliyah was awake before her alarm. She had slept, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake the way people lie awake before irreversible things, cataloging everything that could go wrong, running the variables. Instead, she had slept deeply and woken clean, the way she woke after a verdict came in correctly, after a brief had landed exactly where she had aimed it. She dressed alone. She had declined the traditional preparations, the suite full of bridesmaids, the mimosas, the choreographed chaos of collective getting ready that she had witnessed at other weddings and had always found faintly exhausting. Her mother had been disappointed by this, had said so twice in the register of a woman who has learned to express disappointment as practicality. And Leah had listened and nodded and done it her way regardless. One person had been permitted, her cousin Renee, who had sat in the corner of the hotel suite that morning with coffee and the particular gift of someone who knows when presence is enough and words are not required. The dress had been her own design, in collaboration with a Haitian-American designer she had found through a client 3 years ago, and had filed away in the part of her mind that collected things she might need later. Off-white, structured at the bodice, falling loose and luminous to the floor, with a subtle shimmer worked into the fabric that only revealed itself when the light moved. No train. She had been adamant about no train. She had no interest in something that required management, that left a part of her always behind her, that demanded the attention of others just to move through a room. The ring was on her right hand for now, moved there deliberately, so that when it returned to her left hand at the altar, the gesture would mean something. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, not in vanity, in assessment. The way she looked at a brief before submitting it, checking not for beauty, but for accuracy. Whether the thing in front of her matched the thing she had intended to produce. It did. Renee said, from the corner, without looking up from her coffee, "He doesn't deserve what's about to happen to him." Aaliyah understood immediately that she meant Marcus. "No," she agreed. "But it's not for him." The church had filled by the time she arrived. She waited in the anteroom off the entrance with her uncle Joseph, a retired professor who had walked her through every significant moment of her adult life with the quiet competence of a man who understands that his job is proximity rather than intervention. He held her arm and looked straight ahead and did not offer her any of the things people typically offer brides in the final minutes before an irrevocable thing. He did not ask if she was sure, did not produce a handkerchief, did not deliver wisdom. He simply stood beside her and breathed steadily. And she matched her breathing to his, and they waited. Through the closed doors, she could hear the organ, and then the organ going quiet, and then the specific quality of silence that 200 people create when they are holding themselves very still. She knew Jaehyun was at the altar. She did not need to see him to know the quality of his stillness in that room. She had spent 8 months learning the specific gravity of him, the way space organized itself differently around a person who had decided, long ago, that he would never again be caught unprepared. He would be standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the doors. He would not be fidgeting. He would not be leaning to whisper to anyone. He would simply be there, entirely, the way he was always entirely, wherever he was. What she did not know was that Marcus had arrived 11 minutes earlier. He had driven from his apartment in a state that he would have described, to anyone who asked, as determination, but which was in fact the specific compound of grief and pride and miscalculation that makes men do the things that men do when they have run out of better options and have not yet arrived at acceptance. He had parked 3 blocks away. He had walked the distance with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set and his mind running the speech he had prepared and revised 17 times in the past 48 hours. He had stood outside the church for 4 minutes, watching the last of the guests file in. And during those 4 minutes, he had 3 separate opportunities to turn around and walk back to his car and make a different decision. And he had not taken any of them. He slipped in through a side door that a distracted usher had left unlocked. He positioned himself near the back wall. He looked at the altar and saw Jaehyun standing exactly as Aaliyah had known he would be standing, and something moved through Marcus at the sight of him. Not fear, not quite. but something adjacent to it, a cellular recognition that he was in the presence of a different category of person than he had encountered before. A recognition that his body processed faster than his mind, and which his mind immediately overruled. Because Marcus Webb's mind had always been very good at overruling his body's better judgment. Then the doors opened. The organ did not play a traditional processional. She had chosen something else. A piece Jae-hyun had played for her once from his phone. Something spare and modern that she had not known before and had not been able to unhear after. Something that moved like water finding its level, rather than like a march toward a destination. The guests turned, and Aaliyah Monroe walked into the room. She walked slowly. Not with the careful, measured pace of a woman afraid of tripping, but with the pace of someone who has decided that this moment belongs entirely to her and intends to occupy every second of it. The black ribbon on the pews caught the candlelight. The lilies were white against the dark wood. She looked at the altar and found Jae-hyun's eyes immediately, the way you find a fixed point in a tilting room, and something passed between them that required no translation. She was most of the way down the aisle when she felt the shift in the room. Not heard it, felt it. The way a room changes when attention divides, when 200 people become uncertain where to look. She did not turn her head. She kept walking. But she knew. Marcus stepped away from the back wall. Aaliyah. His voice came out louder than he had intended. It always did when he was afraid. Please, stop. She stopped. Not because he had asked her to. She stopped because she chose to, the way she chose everything. Deliberately, on her own terms, at the moment of her own selection. She stood in the aisle and she turned, slowly, with the full composure of a woman who has already won and knows it. And she looked at Marcus Webb for the first time in 8 months. He looked diminished. This surprised her, and then it didn't. Grief had a way of editing people down to their essential components, and what remained of Marcus without the easy charm, without the confidence of a man who believed consequences wouldn't reach him, was something thinner than she remembered. His eyes were red. His coat was slightly wrong, a button misaligned. And on any other day she would have told him, because old habits are durable. But not today. Marcus, she said, and her voice in the silence of that church was very clear and very steady. I'm glad you came. He blinked. That was not what he had expected. I need to say something to you, she continued. Something I should have said 8 months ago, in a parking garage, when I was sitting alone in the dark trying to understand what I was grateful for. She paused. Around her, 200 people held their breath. At the altar, Jae-hyun had not moved, had not signaled anyone, had not changed his expression. He was watching her the way he watched everything, completely, without interference, understanding that this moment was hers to finish. You cheated on me, she said. You made a decision that you thought I would never fully recover from. And I want to thank you for it. Genuinely. Because the version of my life that exists on the other side of that decision, this room, this day, this man at the end of this aisle, none of it would exist if you had simply been who I thought you were. Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came. You gave me back to myself, she said. I didn't know I'd lost me until you forced me to look. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did in depositions when she was about to close something. I hope you find something worth finding, Marcus. I really do. But it isn't here. She turned back to the altar. She began walking again. Behind her, Marcus Webb stood in the center of the aisle, surrounded by strangers, several of whom he had not yet understood were watching him with the particular professional attention of men who are paid to watch. And he did not move, and did not speak. And the room did not look at him anymore, because there was nothing at the altar drawing every eye that the room had to offer. Jae-hyun stepped down from the altar when she was 3 paces away. Not protocol, not planned. He simply stepped down and met her where she was, and took both her hands and looked at her the way he had looked at nothing else in 4 years, with the full weight of a man who has stopped protecting himself from wanting something, and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, Section 4 revisions were accepted. She laughed. It was the most genuine sound in the room. The ceremony was brief, because they had both agreed in advance that the words were less important than what the words were pointing toward, and that prolonging the performance added nothing to the substance. When the officiant reached the moment of confirmation, Aaliyah spoke her yes with the same tone she had used 8 months ago in a penthouse. Clear, decided, entirely without performance. Marcus left before the recessional. One of Jae-hyun's men held the side door open for him without a word, a courtesy so precise in its delivery that it took Marcus 3 blocks of walking before he understood it had also been a message. He sat in his car in the cold November air and looked at his hands on the steering wheel, and thought about a woman who had turned his worst decision into her best beginning. And he understood, finally and completely, that some reckonings do not arrive as punishment. Some of them arrive as clarity. And clarity, once it comes, cannot be unfelt. Inside the church, Aaliyah Monroe, now Kwan, walked back up the aisle with her hand in the hand of a man who had told her the truth before she asked for it, who had written her protections before she knew she needed them, who had met her in the middle of an aisle rather than making her come the full distance alone. The candles burned, the ribbons caught the light. 200 people, half of whom owed this man their livelihood and their safety, stood and watched a woman who had been underestimated her entire life arrive, finally and completely, at the exact coordinates of her own power. And in the silence after the recessional, when the guests had begun to move and the room had released its held breath at last, Renee leaned over to Dana, who had been invited because Aaliyah did not forget the people who protected her, and said simply, "She always knew what she was doing." Dana nodded. She always does. Little did either of them know, little did anyone in that room fully know, in the warm, candlelit aftermath of a ceremony that looked like a wedding and was also, in every structural sense, a coronation, that the story was not ending here. That what had been built in 8 months of careful, parallel decision-making between 2 people who had learned to expect very little from the world and had quietly decided to expect more from each other was not a conclusion, but an architecture. A foundation laid precisely, stone by stone, in the full knowledge of what it would need to bear. The city outside was still flat and silver. The Hudson moved the way it always moved, without caring about the things that happened on its banks, without marking the moments that the people beside it considered significant. But in a church on the east side of Manhattan, a woman who had been cheated on and had said thank you and had meant it in a way that no one understood until now, walked out into the cold air with her husband's hand in hers and her face tilted slightly upward, and she breathed. Clean. Final. The kind of breath that comes at the end of a sentence that has been building for years. And Marcus Webb drove home alone. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely and later realized that their failure was actually the door that led you exactly where you were meant to be? Have you ever been underestimated, written off, or left behind by someone who never truly saw the full depth of what you were capable of, only to rise in a way they never imagined possible? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, transformation, and the quiet power of knowing your own worth, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.